Hello everyone, welcome back to another one of our RWBY Bible studies. If you've been with us through volumes 1 through 4, I hope that this study will be as much a blessing as the ones before it, if not more so. But for those of you who are just joining us, who are new to this whole RWBY Bible study scene, understand the purpose of what this study is all about. Our goal here today is to discuss the parallels and the connections between RWBY Volume 5 and the person and character of Jesus Christ. Now, parallels can accomplish some things. They can provide a clearer and closer picture, an illustration, if you will, of something that may not be as familiar to us as we'd like it to be. So, for example, there's a definite parallel between John's semblance in Acts chapter 20 and verse 35. It is more blessed to give than to receive. The cowardly lion in Leonardo and the Judas Iscariot syndrome, where we have this archetype of a traitor. Hazel and Hebrews 12:15, no root of bitterness spring up, for by it not only destroying you, but also defiling many. Something to avoid, a cautionary tale, to be certain. But all of these connections, all of these parallels rather, are basically empty if there isn't an actual connection. And the connection is what we're ultimately here to do. Because understand the difference between just a personal picture of Scripture and an actual connection between the character of Jesus Christ. That's going to be our goal in this study today. Not just say, oh, that's neat and that sounds similar, oh, that looks and that rhymes. We're going to be talking about applying a very, very important theme in the Bible and using its connections to RWBY and the story that, once again, magnificently told story, and a wonderful one that I trust everyone here was also able to enjoy. But as we're talking about this, I want you all to pay careful attention to this connection and use it not only as a picture to provide a clearer understanding, but to see there is a link here. There is something that actually makes RWBY worth comparing to the Bible because they have a very, very important message in common. Now, that message is going to be essentially summarized in Blake Belladonna's description of those around her. You remember, as the poetry type that she was, if she had one word and was only given one word to describe those around her, for RWBY it was purity, for Yang it was strength, for Weiss it took a while, but eventually she learned it was defiance. Sun's still working on it, and we're hoping for that ship, right? But nonetheless, earnest. And lastly, Adam was spite. But in today's study, I'd like to discuss with you not only applying and discovering this kind of logic and how she came to these conclusions using other characters that weren't necessarily given names, but that we could very well tell what word would describe them. And also you apply that same logic and see if we can give Jesus a word that describes him. And the words that we're essentially going to be discussing will start in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 13. So easy enough to find chapter and verse, they're the same. Where it reads the following: Now abide faith, hope, love. These three, but the greatest of these is love. 1 Corinthians 13 is a fantastic chapter in Scripture because it is essentially Paul the Apostle laying his cards out on the table and saying this is what's most worthwhile. Love. And not the kind of love you describe as admiration, affection, or even attraction to someone else, but this kind of love that is unique only to the character of Jesus Christ. Now, before we go into that, let's start on some common ground here. Raven Bronwyn, what do you think would be a word to describe her? Well, as Blake was able to come up with words that described RWBY and Yang and everyone's personality, what ultimately led her to those kind of conclusions? Well, let's start with the basics. What are some of their titles, what they're known by? Who are they as individuals? Raven had plenty to sport. She was the head of the Bronwyn tribe, a former member of Team Stark, and spoiler alert, she was even the Spring Maiden. But this wasn't enough in order for us to come to a conclusion, right? Otherwise, Blake would have described Yang as just daughter of Tai Yang Xiaolong, and RWBY would have just been daughter of Summer Rose or Silver Eyes or something, just taking a face value look at her. Red Hood, right? What would you describe RWBY as? Red. What would you describe Yang as? Yellow. Black. White. You get the amusing point here. It's not just enough to look at the titles. We want to go deeper. We want to see if there's actually a reflection of their heart. And since surgery is dangerous, why don't we just look at their actions instead? Because from the heart springs forth actually what we say, what we do, who we are, is defined by our actions as much as our titles, what other people call us. What did Raven do? Well, a lot of things. She overpowered Cinder. Okay, so would powerful be it? She outsmarted Salem's servants. Would clever or devious even? I mean, granted, Salem's servants are not the kind of friends you want to have, so we'd probably consider it very noble. She was strong, she was smart, but she ran away at the end of everything. How interesting. Running away from Salem, that with that last hallucination that Emerald gave us, we understand that, but from Salem, from her servants, even from her own daughter, how interesting is it that once she did that, motives became clear. And this image of integrity, a term that just comes from the word integer, which is a whole number, not nothing and not a fraction, but a whole number. Whether that's positive or negative is another issue. But everything that makes up who she was, how interesting is it that her tendency to run away from everything ultimately defined her character and drew her in very close comparison to our second character that we'd like to give a word to. And I know that Raven hasn't been given a word yet, but she's going to have a lot in common with this next one, which the moment I say his name, you're going to know right away. Leonardo Lionheart. What would be a word to describe him? Well, the Queen herself described him as coward. We would probably just outright save ourselves a few letters and just say fear. But what was he? What described him ultimately? What defined him as that? Let's understand the logic before we come to conclusions about Jesus, because we're prepping for something, right? Well, Leonardo Lionheart, he was the headmaster of Haven, friend of Ozpin, a huntsman. If I were to just look at those things, would I come to the conclusion that he was a coward? That fear would be the word to describe him? Well, no, it would be the same kind of reasoning that Blake was concluding when she looked at Adam and saw justice and decided that that actually wasn't the case. We're talking about something that goes a lot deeper than just titles, because what did Leonardo do that ultimately showed his heart and character? He betrayed his fellow huntsmen and friends to Salem for the sake of his own safety. Quite a cowardly act indeed. But noting that Raven and Leonardo had this characteristic in common of fear, how interesting that they were contrasted by someone like Yang. She'll be our third character that we'll be analyzing to basically get a grasp of Blake's thinking. Who was Yang? Now again, we already know the word to describe her, right? Strength. But who was she in Volume 5? We can look at a lot of the things that she would have characteristically, a member of Team RWBY, but isolated from the group, so wouldn't really apply. Likewise, she gave atomic wedgies basically to the entire Bronwyn tribe in order to get them to bring her to her mom. But once again, not a characteristic of her. If we were to just describe what she was in Volume 5, we'd just have to be honest and say she was a wounded and frightened teenager. We saw her dealing with that in Volume 4 as well, but understand this, it wasn't who she was that made the difference. It was what she did. And despite being a wounded and frightened teenager, what did she do? She went into battle despite her fear. She faced down her mother for the relic of Haven with one arm. What she had was pain. What she had was fear. Yet in spite of the obstacles, she acted and demonstrated true strength, a word fit to describe her. Not just because of who she was as a person, but on top of that, what she did, the demonstration of true character, of integrity, proven character over time. So with this line of thinking then, it's not just enough to be something, but what do you do with those titles? Because again, was Raven powerful? Was Raven smart? But why? Did Leo have a good reputation? Could he, or rather was Crow foolish for trusting him, or did he actually have reason to? But ultimately, what mattered in the end? So with this logic in mind, what word would we use to describe Jesus? Well, Paul gave us three: faith, hope, and love. But before we pick one, and again, if you remember the verse, you probably know where I'm going with this, but let's just follow Blake's reasoning. Let's solve the equation according to what the teacher gave us so that we can make sure that we're forming the right conclusions here. We want to be informed, not just the first to respond. Who was Jesus? Well, very simply put, he was God incarnated in human form. God the Son. And note this, son can mean one of two things. I have a biological father, so I relate to him as a son in that sense. But when we're referring to Jesus, we're not saying that God produced a biological offspring. Jesus existed forever with God and was God. There's a unique distinction, a unity, yet in diversity. That's where we get our term, university, by the way, because the Greeks just understood that if there is this foundation for everything that we want in life with a relationship, then the cause, the ultimate source of those things, what they considered God but didn't know yet, had to have this kind of characteristic within itself. And we saw that was revealed in the person of Jesus Christ in history. But understand as well, it's a relational term. To relate to someone as a father does a son. You can have a father but not relate to them as a son. It's just a biological title, but it's also a relational one. And that's in the sense we call Jesus God the Son, and likewise God the Father. But understand this as well. When he took on human nature and he interacted with his creation in a moment of history, we're not just saying that because other people have said it. We're saying it because the people who saw it firsthand said it. The Gospel of John, chapter 1 and verse 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And in the same chapter, verse 14, it says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory as the only begotten of the Father, full of grace," just means beautiful, "and truth." Now understand, this passage doesn't just give us an understanding of who Jesus was, eternally existing, God himself, but revealed himself to mankind by putting skin on and interacting with his creation in a way that we just, well, first off, we should have been expecting. We'll get more to that in a second. But quite interestingly, in a way that no one had ever seen. Because it wasn't just enough who he was, right? It's what he did. And what did he do when he revealed himself to this earth in the person of Jesus Christ? He gave his life as a ransom from death for all of us and offers a relationship with himself through trusting that promise that as he rose from the dead, never to die again, because understand there's a difference between resuscitation and resurrection, given a new body, a new heart, a new nature that can handle being perfect, that won't get bored, that won't get old, that won't get weak. That kind of resurrection, that if you trust in what he did, you will do likewise. Well, let's make sure that we're informed on this matter. John chapter 3 and verse 17. "For God did not send his Son in the world to condemn the world." God just didn't come down and say, "You're all a bunch of sinners," and then just took off. No, that the world might be saved through him. And then likewise in the book of Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 26, it says, "For such a high priest," referring to Jesus, "was fitting for us, who is holy, perfect, complete," from the word whole, right? "Harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, has become higher than the heavens, who does not need daily, as those high priests," referring to the Old Testament, the Jews who had to offer the blood of an animal on their behalf. The wages of sin is death. I separate myself from life, something has to die. God put a system in place where you could have a substitute, but foreshadowing him. How do we know that? Because he says, we offered up sacrifices for our own sins, then for the people's. That was the high priest's job. They were still human, they were still sinners. And they had to deal with their own problems before they came to God with everyone else's. But catch this. For this he did once for all. He doesn't have to die and then you sin again and so he has to re-die and then you can be forgiven. No, once for all. When he offered up himself. He was that sacrifice who died in your place as your substitute. Now catch this. All of this information that we know about who Jesus was and what he did. If you have questions about what we discussed, leave them in the comments below. But for the relevance of this study's topic, what word would we then have to describe Jesus if this is what he did? If this is who he was? Combination of both, right? Well, Paul gave us 3 virtues that make a Christian a Christian. I was a follower of Christ, so naturally they would be the one to set his example, but that's 3 words, not 1. We just want 1, right? Which would it be if we had to pick one? Well, let's start in ascending order. Faith was the first mentioned, and that word, it's often misunderstood. It's a word that means worthy of trust, a willingness to trust. If someone is faithful, it means trustworthy. So, can Jesus be called faithful? Yeah, I'd say so. Considering the Old Testament is filled to the brim with promises after promises of what we call prophecies, predictions in advance, some given hundreds and even 1,000 years before the events themselves took place, describing crucifixion, describing where he'd be born, and the circumstances surrounding it, where he'd be teaching, the impact and response that people would have initially. Hundreds of other details that we can number above 300 that go into such a narrow margin of error that literally the only way that we could trust those kind of odds pulling off by coincidence is if the system was rigged. And indeed it was. This wasn't coincidence. This was God intentionally stacking the deck in his favor so people would recognize him when he arrived. But also understand this. When we're talking about Jesus being trustworthy, it's not just because of who he is. God, the foundation of everything we call truth, everything that we call knowledge. He put those systems in place. But God didn't just say, I'm God, therefore I'm trustworthy. No, he put his money where his mouth was. He made promises, and he kept them. And that's what brings us into the second term. Would hope be a word to describe Jesus? Yes, as our hope. He's the only chance that we have of going to heaven. But also understand as well, hope describing Jesus. Was he a hopeful person? Well, think. When Jesus died on that cross, did he know who would receive and reject it? Absolutely. And yet, he stayed on there, even knowing that it would be the broad way many would go by, and into destruction, the narrow way to truth, the narrow way to heaven. That would be something that few would go by his own words. And yet he still was willing to give his life for the sins of the entire world, not just the specific ones that would actually accept it. That's a very hopeful statement, don't you think? Because even knowing they would reject it, he still hoped. He still gave them the opportunity to receive it despite the fact that he knew most of them would reject it. If it was the case that even one would receive it, it would be all worth it to him. That's also interesting because it actually ties in line not just with faithful. He's trustworthy because a hope, right? It's a expectation, an earnest expectation of things to come, things that haven't happened yet. And Jesus, an expectation for the joy set before him, despite not being happy on the cross, he found an eternity with you worth every second of it. We are then brought to that third term. We can trust Jesus to be faithful. That might be a word to describe him. We can describe him as hopeful. He's not only our hope, but demonstrated a lot of hope when he gave up his life for the majority of people who wouldn't even receive it. But love, motive is the key, right? Love. And again, the love that's specifically described for us in 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 8, leading up to the passage that we opened the study with. And there's plenty of examples that he gives of it. It's love suffers long. It's very patient and kind. Again, I can be patient, but I'm kind of cranky when you push me, right? Does not envy, does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not rejoice in wrongdoings, but rejoices when good things happen. bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. Faithful, right? Faith, hope, all inclusive in this unique kind of love. And again, we describe love in many ways. We'd say affection or attraction, or in a friendship sense, admiration. All these different ways. But the kind of love that Jesus demonstrated when he came to this earth wasn't any of those. He didn't pursue you because he desired you above everyone else. He didn't choose a relationship with you. He didn't do what he did on the cross just as a nice demonstration of his heart, though that was a part of it. And he didn't do this just as a principle either. It wasn't because, he just had such hope in humanity that he thought this demonstration would inspire them. Any look at history, you think Jesus, knowing everything, wouldn't fall for that. We're talking about a love that sacrifices itself for the sake and benefit of another. And it wasn't enough for God to just be God, was it? Once again, he proved it with actions by giving his life for people who hated him, who wanted nothing to do with him. Romans chapter 5, 6 through 8. You'd die for a good person, you'd give your life for a great person, but God demonstrates his own love towards us in that while we were sinners, condemned from him, guilty of a capital crime in eternity, that is when he redeemed you and me. That is when he demonstrated his love towards you. It's one thing for Jean to seek the healing of Weiss. It would be another thing for him to run to Mercury's rescue, wouldn't you think? It would be another thing for him to go after and save Cinder from falling. I just got that. Anyway, so we're making a point in all of this. What word would we use to describe Jesus? Well, I'd say the most fair and inclusive bet would be love. And not the kind of love that we demonstrate, not a love that has strings attached, not a love that has essentially a motive behind it, or rather an agenda, I should say. Everything has a motive, otherwise you wouldn't do an action, but you understand the point that's being made here. We're talking about a love that is absolutely unique from anything and everyone else has been able to in history. We're talking about a love that essentially was able to say, you are, truthfully speaking, a rebel against me. You are worthy of the death penalty for even the smallest of infractions, and I'm going to look at you and I will give up my life. I will endure hell itself as the only being capable of suffering an infinite amount and still being able to walk away. For your sake, for your benefit, I love you when you hated me. Now understand this. If you're thinking, well, I've done a lot of those bad things, can God really love me? Well, to quote Jean d'Arc, he's got a lot of it. I still believe him. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. If you have sincere questions, ask them. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, do so. But most importantly, remember why we're doing these studies. Because there are people who don't know these things, who don't know that God loves them, who don't know how he's proven it. And if you want to join this ministry's efforts in bringing the gospel, this good news, to people who otherwise wouldn't hear it, who wouldn't have those connections, who aren't being met on those common terms, please share this study with anyone you feel would be blessed by it, whether it's in video or you yourself taking this information and sharing with it in person. My desire isn't for more subscribers, likes, or views. I want to see people with us in heaven. And if you feel that you can reach someone with this study, do so. Thank you for your time. Remember that Jesus loves you, and remember the key connection in all of this. What is the one thing that makes all the difference as to whether or not someone could be described as one word or another? It's their heart. And look at what God's heart has demonstrated and how he felt towards you.